Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alana, and we review books on this channel. The occasional book haul, the occasional tag. Before I jump into this War and Peace review, a couple of things. I was thinking there will be very little book hauls on this channel this year, and hopefully moving forward. I have only purchased 2 books this year since the beginning of January, and I am recording this at the end of February. And I have a list of books I'd like to purchase this year, but it's a small list. So I might have a potential book haul halfway through the year. We'll see. So yeah, I've been really good. I've been more fascinated by shopping what I already own. Also, as I'm recording this at the end of February, this is a sneak peek into my March reading and then the beginnings of my April reading. So let's take a look. I've got Mansfield Park, which I have put off reading for years. No particular reason. I just got distracted by other things. I've got Orlando by Virginia Woolf, Duck's Newburyport, which I'm going to read via audio because I feel like it would be a really good fit. Just the style in which it's written, to kind of absorb it audibly. But I am going to figure out a way how to follow along with the audiobook since this book has no chapters. Then I have Abigail from an Hungarian author whose name I will not do the disservice of trying to pronounce at this moment. And The Commandant's Girl by Pam Jenoff, which is going to be my bedside table read for the month of March, and A Very Nice Girl. So venturing back into my millennial fiction. And A Very Nice Girl I'm predicting to be a mediocre read, but better than Conversations with Friends. The bar's low. With Conversations with Friends, it doesn't take much to beat that book. Then for side note, this is a pretty hefty stack, is it not? It's a pretty hefty stack. But I have a trip planned, a 4-day trip planned in March, but that will culminate to about at least 8 hours round trip on a train. So I'll be able to knock out Mansfield Park in a couple weeks. Then in April, I've got some books that I'm really excited to read. I'm going to reread The Priory, so that's going to be my bedside read for April. Mary Louise Bennett's Checkout 19, which I felt would be a really good couple or pairing with Within a Budding Grove, Volume 2 of In Search of Lost Time, because they're these like childhood musings. So I thought that would be a good pairing. And then I have Writers and Lovers by Lily King. I might be able to squeeze in another book. We'll see. I haven't determined what I want my audiobook to be for the month. Then let's hop into War and Peace, the much awaited War and Peace. There was a piece of dust there. So let's hop into this review. I don't know how long this is going to take me. My longest review to date, my 2 longest reviews, Conversations with Friends and Outlander, the first book. I don't think this book is going to take that long to discuss, but maybe a good 25 minutes or so. So get yourself a cup of tea, get yourself a snack, put the headphones in, do some chores. We're going to talk this massive chunker. My guy Tolstoy. I do have some critiques for this book. We're gonna do some critiquing, but overall I enjoyed it. What kind of force is it that directs everything? So War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. It was a bit intimidating, I'm not gonna lie, to sum up this novel. Not because of the content, it's just because of the sheer size of it. My edition is over 1,300 pages. This is a dynamic narrative. It spans several years, decades really, because is it decades? I would say decades when you count in, what he kind of discusses, what happens to these characters in the epilogue of these characters' lives. And there's a slew of characters, as we know, is pretty standard when it comes to these big Russian novels. There's just the whole family trees and then everybody else's family tree. This is particularly set during the Napoleonic Wars, and this novel highlights what's happening on the war front, but also with actual historical figures. So you have the Tsar of Russia making an appearance, you've got Napoleon himself making appearances, and then we also have what's happening more on the home front, what's happening socially with the upper class Russian life. And so you have these 2, narratives, but you have these 2 contrast war versus a social life happening within parallel. I am going to not even go through the names of all these characters and all that. I will barely mention specific characters' names in this review. Who has time for an hour? I ain't got time for that. But I would say the main characters boil down to Pierre, who is a seemingly naive man who is constantly on the search for meaning and truth. We have Natasha, a young woman who's coming of age during this time, especially at the beginning of the novel, and she's learning about the harsh realities of love through her own youthful mistakes. Natasha does some things in this novel, in her youth and in her immaturity. You're like, ugh. But she does, her character development has an arc. We have Prince Andre, who's actually my personal favorite, probably because he's cynical. I like a good cynical character. He's cynical, though dashingly handsome. You know I can't resist a stud. Okay. And he is a harsh man emotionally. He is a cynical man. But he does have these moments in which he's somewhat softened. But I wouldn't say that he's ever really fully softened. He remains rather cynical, I think, through the end. And we have the Rostov family, who I'm kind of grouping into one, because we follow this wealthy family. They have social wealth, but they're also on the brink of financial ruin. And so we have all of these characters and events in War and Peace that are interweaving with each other. And then we're dealing with love and relationship and war and life and death, the social forays of Russia at this time. Each individual takes on a role in this fabric of history that Tolstoy is using in World War Peace, and discusses these concepts of inevitability, fate, and this in Tolstoy's brand of philosophy / the laws of history. That was a mouthful. However, all that being said, this book is not difficult to read. It's just big. I will say, just go ahead and say this, not once in this book or while reading did I ever get confused about who was who or what was happening or where I was within the plot. And this is the Anthony Briggs translation, which I really enjoyed. And you get a list of characters, and at the end of this particular edition, you actually get this a chapter by chapter synopsis at the end of this book. So if you maybe put this book down for a while and you're picking it up and you're like, what chapter I'm in, what just happened, you can actually go back and just get a 1 or 2 sentences about what each chapter was about. But there are spoilers in some of those, so use with caution. But yeah, I never felt overwhelmed by this book. I chipped away at this book. It only took me 6 to 6.5 weeks, which is pretty good. That's why I selected this book for a November read, because I had November, I finished it halfway through. I finished it right before Christmas. I started it halfway through November, and I had a lot of holiday time off work, so, and a trip. I had a road trip in there too, so I knocked out quite a bit. There are a lot of interesting themes in this book, and I'm just going to cover the ones that stick out to me the most. Again, this is a book where you could discuss it for hours, so I had to really limit what it is I wanted to talk about. So we have this idea of the collective versus the individual in this book, which I feel like is something I've talked about in quite a few of my recent reviews, Conversations with Friends, Slaughterhouse-5. I think it's I think it's a theme that a lot of books talk about, especially once you get to the 20th century and you have certain political or economic structures kind of making their way in Europe. So people are, especially in Europe, people are having these conversations more about the collective versus the individual, especially when you have World War I and World War II. Even though he's predating that, so he's 19th century, but it's a theme that comes up a lot. Let's keep rolling. Every general and every soldier was aware of his own insignificance, like a tiny grain of sand in an ocean of humanity, yet as a part of a vast whole, they sensed a huge collective strength. Pierre could not see these people as individuals. He saw them all as together in movement. It was necessary for those millions of men who wielded the real power to do what they were told by one or two feeble individuals, and to have been brought to this point by an infinite number of complex and desperate causes. Tolstoy is making the argument that the individual is a part of the collective. However, the individual still has an impact on history. It's lots of individuals making choices that causes things to accumulate into massive events. This flows really nicely into Tolstoy's major theme. If it is not, you could argue, the theme of War and Peace, how history is subject to inevitability and fate. Even though we as people, individuals, as characters seem to act autonomously, or we think we are acting autonomously, are we really doing that? Tolstoy is arguing that there are larger forces that manipulate events, ensuring that there are just certain things that are going to happen, regardless of what you think or what you try to do. It's going to happen. I cannot wait to review, because after I do this, record this video or review, I'm going to record the second book of Outlander, Dragonfly and Amber. If these two books tie in immaculately, but I'm going to get into that in the next review. So subscribe. But so he's arguing that how much control does the individual have? Because this is odd dichotomy of the individual still has an impact, but it's an impact that's part of this soup of history that's just bound to happen. It was now obvious to all that the affair that had begun so lightly could not now be averted. It had its own momentum, nothing to do with anyone's will, and it would have to run its course. It was all fate. We are victims of fate. Everything's been leading up to this. Kings are the slaves of history. History, the amorphous, bear with me, that is a tongue twister, unconscious life within the swarm of humanity exploits every minute in the lives of kings as an instrument for the attainment of its own ends. Side note, why is it that there are certain words that you only come across in literature? You don't hear them out in everyday life. And so when you come across them and you actually have to say them out loud, you're like, how do I say that? Anyway. So yeah, this is something that when it comes to inevitability, fate, these events clicking together, these small events clicking together that are adding up to large events, he uses the example of clocks and cogs a lot, how everything is just moving and synchronizing to lead up to something. There's only so much you can do to really prevent something from happening. He repeats this ad nauseum. From beginning to end, in all over 1,300 pages of this book, that is what Tolstoy talks about. And he's using these characters to discuss these things and the events that happen in their life, both during the war, at war, in their personal lives, at home. That is what Tolstoy does over and over, which is one of my critiques of this book. I'll get to that in the end. He's extremely repetitive about how events are destined to happen. And he's also weaving in this philosophy of how history is made and how history is recorded. What is the cause of historical events? Power. What is power? Power is the collective will of the masses transferred to a single person. There's a lot of critiquing of history and how it's recorded in this novel. Tolstoy notes that wars and historical fictions are often romanticized, which in turn adds a layer of myth to these events and to these people. Even those who are alive during these said events, they tend to romanticize things because they have fallen in love with an ideal. Or sometimes, after time passes, you're only left with certain bits, you're left with certain accounts. And so it's those romanticized accounts from historians that tend to get embedded in a culture, in a society, or in a memory about what actually happened, even though it may actually not be accurate at all. That's actually something that Hilary Mantel talks about, and that's kind of what's underlying in her Wolf Hall trilogy. which is why I think she talks so much about myths and these mythological creatures like phoenixes and giants and stuff in those books. He had, of course, fallen in love with the Tsar and the Russian military, honor and the hope of future glory. But he was not alone in these sentiments. At that moment, 9/10 of all the men in the Russian army were in love, albeit less ecstatically, with their Tsar and the Russian military honor. Tolstoy makes sure to emphasize that once that romanticization is peeled away and reality sets in, one has to acknowledge that historical figures are flawed and that war is just terrible. That's one reason why I think that Tolstoy made an effort to make sure that Napoleon was a character in this book and that the Tsar of Russia was a character of this book, because there's this romanticized ideal that we have of these historical figures, but there's that just went down the wrong way. But then there's also a reality. These were men. They were flawed. They are also victims, if you will, of this inevitability of fate. They're just pawns in a way, even though they seem to have a lot of power. They're just pawns for these ultimate outcomes. And so he's almost kind of reminding the reader through the way that he describes, especially the physical characteristics of Napoleon in particular, that he was just a man. He makes sure to also highlight the things about Napoleon that would not necessarily be flattering. Regardless of what a nice painted portrait is going to portray of Napoleon, he was a man who would be subject to a cold. He's a man who is going to not have the best nights of sleep, so he's going to wake up looking puffy and gray in the face and tired. He's short. He's going to be a little pudgy as he gets older with middle age. Tolstoy makes sure to highlight all of those things to humanize the character and make these historical figures seem less like deities. And again, he's also going to make sure to remind his reader that war is really nothing that should be romanticized. And this is what he says. War is not being nice to each other. It's the vilest thing in human life, and we ought to understand that and not play at war. It's a terrible necessity, and we should be strict about it and take it seriously. The aim of war is murder. The weapons of war are spying, treachery, the destruction of people, and the moral basis of the military class is the curtailment of freedom through discipline, linked with idleness, ignorance, cruelty, debauchery, and drunkenness. He minced no words. He's not playing. So I think one thing I liked about reading about warring tongue twister. One thing I liked about reading War and Peace, especially in a day and age in which, because of modern technology, I can be in the United States and watch what is happening in other countries that are currently being devastated by war. War is a horrible thing. Both sides suffer because there's always a loss of human life in the most gruesome ways possible. It also kind of reminds me of Slaughterhouse-Five, in which there's a quote, and I'm going to paraphrase, in which Billy Pilgrim is saying to his sons, don't ever, whether what side you're on, you never look at the enemy and be glad that that person died, that there's murder here. It's all murder. It's just gruesome. And so war tends to put people in these camps of, I'm pro this, I'm pro that, I'm anti this, I'm anti that, when at the end of the day, it's just devastating and it's very sad. And there's always innocents that suffer on both ends of the spectrum. You cannot control where you were born. You can't control where you live in some cases, especially in certain countries where it may be harder to leave. So, yeah. That's my 2 cents. I don't even know if that made sense. We're going to roll with it. I'm actually almost done with this. Again, this is such a big book. I just wanted to kind of get to the meat and the potatoes of it and hopefully whet your appetite just enough, if you haven't read this yet, to pick this book up, because it's way more approachable than I think it gets than its reputation tends to, than its reputation. So lastly, this is the last thing I'm going to discuss before I kind of go into my final thoughts. There are a lot of characters in this book that come to terms with how morality is subjective and will vary from person to person. We see this most blatantly, I think, in Pierre, because he is the main character in this book, or I would say the predominant character in this book, that is trying to figure out what is truth, what's truly moral, what is the truth. He's obsessed with the truth, and he does this through, he becomes a Freemason to try to figure out what truth is. He turns to religion. At one point, he's a prisoner of war at some point. And so he's just coming in contact with these various people with various thoughts and philosophies. And he's just trying to figure out what is the ultimate truth. But he also comes to the realization that each person, depending on how they're raised, what their backgrounds are, everybody has an opinion. And that truth is going to kind of, it's going to be a little bit gray depending on who you're talking to. So he has to acknowledge that there's some subjectivity to some of these philosophies. And so these ways of kind of reasoning about and trying to make sense of what life is or what the truth is. For the first time in his life, Pierre was struck by the endless variety of men's minds, which guarantees that no truth is ever seen the same way by any two persons. And it's not just Pierre that goes through this, but I think Pierre is kind of the catalyst, the main focus when it comes to this idea. We have other characters, the Rostovs, Prince Andrei, Prince Andrei's sister, who I actually think is a really, really interesting character, Natasha. As they experience hardships and more challenges in their relationships, they start to really come to terms with the realities of war. They have to acknowledge that there are so many nuances to circumstances and people. Pierre is a character that connects with a lot of characters, regardless of if they're French or Russian. Pierre spent a lot of time in Paris, and so when he comes across or comes in contact with French soldiers, for a while, he's able to play off that he's French because his French is immaculate. They can't tell that he's Russian at all at first. They're like, "Are you French?" And so he's able to kind of code switch, if you will. So we have this idea again of what is the truth. I'm switching hands because that book is heavy. Look how red my hand is. What is the truth? Is there an ultimate truth, etc.? I'm going to wrap this up. I was right. I said it would take me about 25 minutes. Okay, so I'm looking at my written review. And this is what I wrote. I said, I'm not going to lie. I feel like I just wrote a whole lot of nothing. That's what it felt like reviewing this book. Because there was just so much that I could potentially discuss. There's so many characters. And I just really had to cherry pick what I wanted to talk about for the sake of time and for the sake of space. I said, this is such a sweeping, massive narrative that I had to pare it down the best I could, just to kind of put enough out there that if you are interested in this book, but you're intimidated by it, maybe just put a little sprinkle out there and say, oh, okay, I think I'm going to make the decision to read this book. Now, generally speaking, I think that the themes aside, what really carries War and Peace are the characters. Their drama. It was like reading a soap opera, but a very sophisticated one. These characters and their love interests and who's cheating on who, okay, who's engaged to who's no longer engaged to who's out here trying to, get some cash money because the family's fitting to go down and because they ain't got no money because the father didn't manage the estate properly, okay? There is some tea in War and Peace. These characters drive this whole narrative because at the end of the day, all of the fascinating philosophy aside about history and inevitability and truth and philosophy, you care the most about these characters and the nonsense that's happening. But they're just delightful. They're engaging. They're funny. Tolstoy is funny. He's funny in that dry humor kind of way. And personally, I got on a lot more with the social sections of this book. That I've heard that a lot when people finish reading War and Peace. Like, I connect. Some people really like the war bits. Some people really like the more social bits. I got on with the social bits because for me, that's where you really saw the drama of these characters, and it was the most entertaining for me. Not saying that there weren't elements of the war sections that I thought were interesting, but I was definitely more partial to the social elements of this book. I did find that the war bits in this book over time became more and more tedious. I found them to be a bit repetitive at times. And there are times I'm like, Tolstoy, do I need a play-by-play of what's happening on the battlefield? Not really. I don't think I do. There are going to be people who love that. I've said this a few times on this channel. I was a history major and I mainly studied wars. I spent a whole semester studying Greek and Roman warfare. And by that, I mean down to military campaigns of certain emperors, down to Roman formations of, the phalanxes and weapons they used. That's how into the details and the weeds that we got. I spent an entire semester studying U.S. military history and campaigns. So yeah, this is not something that's foreign to me. But when I'm reading it in a narrative, not going to lie, it can be a little tedious. But there are some elements there, and I would say the best way to read those sections is to, again, focus on what the characters are doing. And don't get so wrapped up in what's happening on the battlefield as much, because really what's happening with the characters and how these soldiers are relating to each other is really, I think, the most significant. I found the points about the philosophy and law and what Tolstoy's point of view is about how history is really what his philosophy of history is, what he calls the laws of history, and this idea of inevitability, I thought was extremely fascinating. I like a novel that will philosophize, but in this book in particular, it is so repetitive that it became tedious. And he's pretty much saying the same thing over and over and over again for 1,300 plus pages. But he's saying it multiple different ways. And the epilogue was so mind-numbingly dull that I wanted to throw the book. There are a couple of chapters in the epilogue that actually wrap up what happened to the characters. That's really all that's important. The rest of it, it's like a 100-page epilogue. He's summarizing his entire philosophy on the history and the laws of history and the inevitability of history. But he already did that in the first 1,200 pages. And you're like, Tolstoy, we know. You beat a dead horse. Stop talking. And that is when I was like, all right, I'm done. I was done. I only really cared. I didn't need to know. You've said it time again. So that is, for me, where War and Peace was so frustrating, is just how repetitive it is. He made his point way too many times. Let me put this down. The book is heavy. Okay. Holding that book was a workout. That being said, as frustrating as the repetitiveness was in this book, War and Peace, for me, is worth the read. The characters are a blast. And I mean, I was just fully engrossed and fully invested in what their stories were and what would happen to them. It's also incredibly well written. And this is coming from it being translated. I found the Anthony Briggs translation to be very approachable and very readable and just not confusing. I think it's a very, very good translation. And there are times that I was like, oh, I'm reading a translated book. What I also liked about the Anthony Briggs is that a lot of translations of War and Peace will leave in the French bits. I don't know French. I wish I knew French. I think French is a stunning language. French is gorgeous. I didn't take French in school. I took Spanish for a long time, but sometimes I wish I had taken French. I took Spanish because in the United States, you're going to use Spanish way more. But French is stunning. But in this book, if you don't have any French, he translates all the French to English, but he makes a note. He weaves it seamlessly into the narrative. In French, the character says, blah, blah, blah. So you know what bits are supposed to be in French. And I found that, and it just flowed. I didn't have to the faff of do I want to translate this or go pop to an end note, whatever. It just was seamless, and I really appreciate that he did that. So if you are intimidated by all the French chunks in War and Peace, I highly recommend the Anthony Briggs translation. If it weren't for the repetitiveness of themes in that obnoxious epilogue, and I know several other of my reading friends who have read War and Peace, they said that epilogue was brutal. Some of them skipped it entirely. Other than the couple of chapters that were about the characters, they skipped the rest of it because he wasn't saying anything new. For me, if it wasn't for that epilogue that was so mind-numbingly irritating and dull, maybe this would have gotten a higher rating, but I still rated it a 4. I see why this is a favorite classic for many people. I may plan to reread this at some point. I just know what sections to skip, the epilogue, or maybe just skim through. But I could see myself reading this. And again, I enjoyed it. Definitely don't regret it. It was a riot, and it just wasn't intimidating. It wasn't as intimidating as you would think it is. That would be Les Mis for me. Les Miserables is the book that is sitting on my shelf. There's just something about Hugo talking about sewer systems that just isn't tickling my fancy. So that. Maybe I might read Les Mis next year. And Moby Dick. I'm already planning my 2024 reading. But yeah, so I enjoyed it. I gave it a 4 out of 5. I had anticipated this being a 5-star read for me. In 2022, it wasn't, but it was still a high rating. You know, for me, a 4 is a high rating. You know, I rarely give out 5s. But again, highly enjoyable. And I annotated it to oblivion. There's just so many good things in that book to ponder over and to think and to say, do I agree with him? Do I not? Or whatever. I enjoyed it. Have you read War and Peace? Is it one of those books that's on your TBR or your to-read list, but maybe you're feeling intimidated by its size? I say go for it. Get the Anthony Briggs section translation. And I tackled this book in 6 to 6.5 weeks just by, again, skimming away at it 20 to 25 pages at a time over the weekends. To get a head start, to really knock out a chunk, I would read 40 to 50 pages over a Saturday, and then another 40 to 50 pages on a Sunday, so I could knock out a good 80 to 100 pages in 2 days. This is a book to save, I think, for the holidays or any time off that you may have, where, say, excellent for summer reading if you have time off work for vacations, or during, the Christmas season, when it's a lot quieter and you have less obligation, so you can just kind of sit and immerse yourself in this book. There are people who do year-long read-alongs and maybe read about a chapter a day. I don't prefer to read these big books like this because I find that you're dragging it out too much for me. I say I let the book dictate the speed in which to read it. Because once I get into the groove of something, I want to keep reading, I don't want to stop right now because of the reading log, I just keep going. Or if I'm like, you know what, I'm going to let this rest for the day. I'm going to let it rest. When you do that, you will be surprised at how quickly a large book will go. And also, because there's a lot of plot, and by plot, I mean you have these various things happening with these multiple characters. You've got what's happening at war. You've got what's happening in these people's social life. You have all these characters and their own interactions. When you step aside from it for too long, or you're only, I think, nibbling away, that's maybe when you can get confused. But when you immerse yourself in it, I think it's when it really flows a lot better. That's my advice on how to tackle something like War and Peace. I'm rambling. We're 35 minutes in. I'm going to stop talking. Again, have you read it? What were your thoughts? Do you plan to read it? And if you haven't read it, what's keeping you from reading it? The size. I know. Don't be intimidated by the size. I'm going to sign off. I would love to know what you think in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave me a comment. And if you would like to see what I get up to outside of YouTube's, it's all book related for the most part. You can follow me on Instagram, where I get up to more book shenanigans. That is also where all of my book reviews go live first. That's also where you can see my monthly TBRs. I always have a post at the beginning of each month dedicated to what I'm reading each month. what my to read list is. And then I always post in my stories at the end or the beginning of the next month what I read during the month. So that is all. I'm going to sign off, and I will see you in the next one.